Welcome to the Innovation Storytellers podcast. We talk to innovators and disruptors in R&D, product managers, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, innovation thought leaders, and their storytellers who help bring their amazing ideas to life. Now, here's your host, Innovation Storyteller, CEO, speaker, and coach to the world's top innovation teams, Susan Lindner.
Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Susan Lindner, and for the last 20 years, I've been helping innovators and disruptors to tell their stories. 10 acquisitions, hundreds of innovative products, and countless hockey stick growth curves in both directions and new categories later. I want to share how great innovations get to market using stories to pave the way. Today, I'm really excited to have Radhika Dutt on our program. She is going to share with us a new radical way of looking at innovation and tell us a little bit about her upcoming book and new ways to think about not just innovating, but also the stories that go around those innovations. So we'll be plumbing the depths of that today. Radhika, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Susan. Great to be here.
So, oftentimes when we start off the show, we want to dive deep into products, and you have a wealth of background. And I just want to share with my listeners for a moment a little bit about your background. Radhika, you are an entrepreneur and a product leader, and you have participated in 4 acquisitions, 2 of which were companies that you actually founded. So you have that amazing zero to exit experience. You're currently the advisor on product thinking to the Monetary Authority of Singapore and Singapore's financial regulator and central bank. Radhika also teaches entrepreneurship and innovation at Northeastern's McKim School of Business and is an advisor to several startups. Radhika co-founded Radical Product Thinking as a movement for leaders creating vision-driven change, and she is the author of an upcoming book scheduled for launch in September 2021. So I don't want to wait anymore. I want to dive into this new radical way of thinking about innovation. So tell us a little bit about what this new radical shift is. And then we'll get into the how of actually we apply this new change.
Great. So maybe a good way to start in terms of what this radical way of thinking is to start with the problem. Kind of what is the problem with the current way of thinking about how we build products? So what I've realized is that, over the last decade, we've learned that to build products, the way you go about it is really through iteration. That if you just iterate long enough, you'll be able to build a successful product. And this is where, the ideas of iterate quickly, move fast, break things, fail fast, learn fast, these have become our mantras for how we will build products. But for every company that was successful by applying these mantras, the reality is that there have been just a graveyard of failures that have failed because, we iterate without having a clear purpose. And so this is where, if we step back and say, what is the problem with this over-reliance on iteration? The problem is that iteration helps you get to where you're going faster because you're using feedback and you're using that to navigate towards where you're going. But where iteration, lean and agile, what they're not helping you do is figure out what is that destination? Like, where are you going in the first place? So it's a way of giving you speed, but not direction. And so this is where we need something more radical. And the problem that I've seen is, I've worked in so many different industries from broadcast and media and entertainment, advertising, finance, telecom, even wine. And what I've found is that across all of these, there's the same set of product diseases that we keep seeing over and over. So to give you a couple of examples of product diseases, right? So one is called pivotitis, where we keep pivoting.
I want to use that as a hashtag, pivotitis. Are you suffering from pivotitis? So what are the symptoms of pivotitis, Radhika?
Yeah, the most acute case of pivotitis, right, is where every sprint feels like a change of direction. So the example that I often share is, I was once working at a startup where we were trying to be the next Visa. And then we realized, that's actually really hard, it turns out, because, you have to acquire merchants, you have to acquire consumers. So we decided, we'll become a merchant loyalty company to a loyalty platform, basically. Then we realized, you know what, that's just really crowded. So then we pivoted and then we became a credit solution company for merchants. And so I was the head of marketing at the time. And by the end of all of these pivots, I didn't even know what to write in my brochures anymore. Right. So that's an acute case of pivotitis. But basically, there are other examples like pivotitis. There is obsessive sales disorder. There is strategic swelling. And we can talk about these diseases. But the main thing that I realized is that we catch product diseases when we don't have a clear vision and a strategy that leads our iterations. So our vision and strategy basically form this purpose, and our iterations have to be purpose driven. And that's the radical shift that I'm helping entrepreneurs, product leaders, and executives to really think about. So how do we build products using this purpose driven approach? How can we do it systematically? Because it may even sound logical, but the reality is, when we actually try to do it, it's so easy to make mistakes. And so even the most well-intentioned startups, kind of in the process of starting with a vision all the way getting to your everyday action, somewhere there's a break in the link. And that's where product disease is set in. And so radical product thinking is a methodology that helps you build successful products very systematically so that you can do it repeatedly while also making the world a better place. Because my view is that, in addition to product diseases, we also want to make the world a better place through our products. And this methodology helps you do both.
So how much of the customer experience is central to having your purpose? Because sometimes in my experience, these pivots are driven by things that have nothing to do with the market. They have nothing to do with the problem that we're actually solving. The last thing you said was, we want to make the world a better place. And yet the question still beckons us, for whom?
Yeah, exactly right. And clearly we can't make it better for everyone, right? But
should we even try?
Well, so let me get a little bit more specific in terms of what I mean, right? So a clear vision in terms of creating this purpose has to answer 4 questions. So whose world are you changing? What does the world look like? Meaning, what is their problem? Why does that problem need solving? Because maybe it doesn't. And then lastly, how are you going to solve this for them? And so starting with your vision, right? It's really customer centric. And so as part of this vision, what we really want to envision is, what does the world look like when you're done? So that's the last how that I talk about. So it's the who, what, why, and the how. So when we envision what does the world look like, hopefully that world, the way you've envisioned it, is one that makes it a little more like the one that we all want to live in, right? So yes, you're making the world particularly good for a few users, but if it's making it worse for a lot of other users, hopefully that's not the world that you're really trying to create. And so the idea is when you create this vision that you're really crafting a picture, like a detailed picture of what does the end state of the world look like if you hang up the banner mission accomplished. And so that's the kind of clear picture your team needs to be able to deliver on a good vision, right? If you're purpose driven and you want a team to actually work, be motivated, that's the kind of clear picture that they want in their heads so that they can reproduce that through their actions.
Let's start off with the radical product thinking as an entrepreneur. So I'm a startup founder. I have this great idea. I really want to bring it to life. And I'm still in this stage of, will it scale? Right? So take us through it in an ideal world, right? We're starting with a clean slate, right? We can kind of set things up right from the beginning using this radical process in a way that maybe we haven't thought of before. What's the best way to start if you're an entrepreneur?
Right. And this is actually something I'm doing with my students at Northeastern. So you start off with an idea for, what's the change that you want to bring about? And then you start to actually talk to your customers and see, is this the world that they want to see as well? Or is this your own itch that nobody else really feels like that is the world that they want to see?
So can I ask just one question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
So we're starting with this question, what is the world I want to see? And in relation to this change, right? Because fundamentally, an entrepreneur is a human being who is bringing about a change, right? An entrepreneur, we believe, is not just someone who is driven by money, right? And perhaps this is a very American understanding of entrepreneur, but entrepreneur oftentimes in the United States is linked with innovator, right? We are bringing about a change as opposed to an entrepreneur who maybe just wants to own 500 real estate developments, right? There may not be a premise of change associated with that. So maybe our thought of that founder is one who wants to envision a change, an innovation, a shift of some kind.
Yeah, exactly in agreement on that. And in fact, the way I define product is that your product is a mechanism to bring about the change that you want to see in the world. So very often we think about our product as the end goal, that a successful product is one that brings about, lots of money. Instead, to me, a successful product is one that's actually able to bring about the change that you had in mind. And the example I often give is, if you look at Facebook, it's a successful product, in terms of every quantitative metric when it comes to financial metrics. But where it fails is it creating the world that we want to see? Really, I don't think so.
Right. And if we watch that movie on Netflix now, The Social Dilemma, and I noticed PBS has one out called The Facebook Dilemma. It has its own movie about Facebook as a dilemma in its own right. And I guess you could conjecture that any great change brought to the world will have its pluses and minuses, right? The car was a huge boon for us, but it also has created a ton of pollution. Is it bringing about the change in the world that we want? Maybe, maybe not. Right.
Yeah. So that is true, right? But I think the pace at which we're creating change is incredible. So if we think about Facebook and how long it took Facebook to get to 500,000 users, it was much longer than how long it took TikTok, for example. And there were recent stats that I read that what Facebook achieved in terms of user growth in 10 years, TikTok achieved in 2 years. So there's this network effect that happens where with every technology, we increase the scale of our influence at a much higher rate than we have in the past.
If you're successful.
If you are successful. But I think every one of us, we go into it thinking, we're going to be successful, right? Or at least that's the mindset we typically would go into it with. And so the thing is that with Facebook and with others, right? Yes, if you're successful, you're changing the world, but we should assume that with each of us and our products, we're changing the world in some way. That scale of influence may be different for each of us, right? But this is why when we put products out in the world, we really have to think about what's the responsibility that comes with it. And so in my book, I talk a lot about the Hippocratic Oath of product. So part of the whole idea of writing a vision statement that is this detailed is that you take responsibility for the change that you want to see in the world. And your product is your mechanism for creating that change. And so you're responsible for the outcome in the world as a result of your product.
That's a covenant that you make with the world and your customer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we are this fresh-eyed innovator who has a new product idea, and we are considering the impact that we want to have on the world and our customer. What comes next?
Yeah. And so, to use some of the terminology that you use, I really feel like it is a matter of creating the story about, whose world are we trying to change? What does their world look like? Why does it need changing? And then how are you going to bring about that change, right? And what does the world look like when you're done? So you're crafting the story, basically, and that's the shared vision that you create with your team. And this is the next piece, which is you may have this wonderful story, but you have to kind of validate whether anyone else shares the story with you. And so this is where you talk to customers and see, does this resonate? So a good vision has to be something that resonates not just with you and your team, but with customers as well. And so that's really a good story, right? Where it really can catch on. And so that's the first step where you've created the story and you realize that, it does resonate with your consumers or with your customer. Then you translate it into a strategy, meaning, so you have this great picture of what's the world, but how will you systematically bring that about? So you have to think about, what are the real pain points that you're solving? Like, what's your solution to those? How do you power that solution? And then what's your business model? How will you support this product? How will you do training? Like all those things that are the actionable details around actually delivering that entire product. And then you have basically your vision and strategy now, which forms that purpose. And now it's time to translate it into your everyday actions. And so that's where prioritization and then finally your iterative, this is where lean and agile execution and measurement comes in. And so you basically take the systematic approach that goes all the way from vision into your everyday activities. That's basically your iterative, lean and agile approach.
So, when I think about a founder, like the founders behind Instagram, let's say, who thought to themselves, wow, I'd love to have a photo sharing app, and you hear the founder discuss how he and his wife were walking on the beach and she said, I think you should really put some filters in there, allow people to customize their photo sharing app a little bit more. What do you think about that? And he was like, nobody's going to want to do that. She's like, no, I really think it would be a good idea. And so he said, okay, we'll add in some filters. At that point, when you think about a photo sharing app, right, it sounds like, okay, it's simple. There were other photo sharing apps before it. And certainly the Facebooks of the world existed already. And certainly Twitter was a place where we could share photos. What do you think that grandiose vision of the world could have been for that founder at the time? Do we need to see ourselves projected into the world so large? Or do we need to say, I want to make a group of customers really happy to connect with their friends? And maybe that's sufficient. Like, how big should that vision be for our first-time founders?
Yeah, so excellent question. I'm so glad you brought this up because I think, our picture of what's a good vision, and we've been trained from, when we were little, that a good vision is one that has to be heroic. It's very often called a BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal. And the radical approach that, I really advocate for is we have to forget all that we've learned about, creating a good vision. It doesn't have to be big or hairy or audacious. It has to be truly one that inspires you. And it has to be something that you authentically feel is a change that's needed in the world. Because the reality, right, is we never know if the change that we want to bring about is going to be big or not. That always happens only in hindsight, that we can look and say, oh yeah, that was such a big idea. But there's no such thing as knowing that something's going to be a big idea at the beginning. And so we really should focus on just what is the change we want to bring about. Our legacy is not always in our control, but what is truly authentic and inspiring to us, that is something we can control.
Yeah. Okay. So we know our customer, we know our purpose, we know our strategy, and we know our vision. And now you got to this last part, which is the execution and the place where potentially pivotitis can really rear its ugly head, right? We have one conversation with one customer, it goes this way. We have a conversation, what features I'd really like to see? And then your next customer says, what features I'd really like to see? How do we filter all of that radically?
So, and you're exactly right. That's often where pivotitis comes in. So, and that's because our vision and strategy are often disconnected from our actual actions. And so what I do is when I talk about prioritization as where your vision and strategy meet the ground, that's your execution. So think of prioritization like the tires. And so the radical approach to prioritization is that I talk to teams about doing this on a very simple 2x2 matrix. So the x-axis is survival, right? Because that's the short-term gains. You kind of have to survive long enough to be able to reach your vision. Your y-axis is your vision. So that's really the end goal that you're aiming for. So in terms of priorities, things that are helping you get towards your vision and it's helping you survive another day, those are, of course, ideal. Those are the decisions where there isn't really a trade-off between the long term and the short term. Like, of course, that's ideal. But the thing is, while those are easy decisions, right? If we always only do what's ideal, then we're only focusing on the short-term things. So sometimes you have to take on things that are good vision fits and that is not helping you survive in the short term. That's called investing in the vision. So you can't do too many of the investing in the vision things, but you do as much of it as you can afford to. So to give you an example, if you're, let's say, going to spend 3 months doing refactoring of code, that is not helping you survive in the short term, but it's definitely helping you in the long term build a better product. Mm-hmm. And so that's investing in the vision. When you're doing the opposite, which is taking on something that's going to help you survive, but it's not a good vision fit, you're really taking on the opposite of investing in the vision, which is vision debt. And vision debt is basically where you're going away from your vision, but you're essentially borrowing against your vision to survive in the short term, right? And so you do this if you need to, because you need to survive, but just like debt, I mean, it compounds over time, and it comes to bite you. And so you do that very carefully. And so the process of prioritization with a team is basically where you say, okay, here are things that are in the ideal category. Those are easy decisions I'll take on. Some things I will do from investing in the vision. And then where I absolutely need to, I'll take on vision debt. And that's vision debt is an example where, if your customer says, oh, I'll buy from you if you add this one custom feature for me. So you do it and it's not helping you long term, but hey, you really need the revenues. And so by having this very systematic approach, by understanding kind of how far away are you getting from your vision sometimes, it really helps you translate that vision and strategy into your everyday activities. But in the process, you're talking about your rationale for why you're taking on certain tasks or certain opportunities. And that's the benefit of using this 2x2, because you're really communicating your vision and facing and talking about the reality of survival with your team, so that you're building this intuition within your whole team of how do you do this trade-off between your vision and survival on an everyday basis. And so that's the kind of alignment that we need, that prioritization and this radical approach brings.
That's fascinating, because you can get lost in a never-ending quest for perfect customization for a customer. And oftentimes the thought is, or the urban legend, right, in product development is, we didn't even think of building a feature like this for a customer. And then we found out it was actually the thing that everyone in the world wanted. And so had we not done that custom feature just for XYZ company, we never would have struck gold. So there is also that lore that, if I just keep iterating to please a customer, then I'll eventually hit that magic vein of gold and I'll be living in the flow for the rest of my life. It may not have been my vision. It was my customer's vision. And now it's my vision. What about that?
So actually, I have used this technique to our advantage. So when I was working at Avid, so Avid Technology, it's the company who probably everyone has seen. Practically every movie that was ever nominated for the Oscar has been edited on an Avid system. So Avid builds, video editing and hardware and software. And so Avid back in 2003 was a newcomer to broadcast. So while they had the entire, movie industry cornered, Sony was the big gorilla that was in the broadcast industry. And so Avid, as this underdog, was competing against Sony. And so we didn't even have enough of an investment in our broadcast division. We were just really starting out. And and because, post-production was such a big piece, that's where kind of all of our funding and resources was going. So we actually ended up using custom engineering as a way of continuing to build our product. And so that was my role back then, where I would actually talk to customers and they would tell us about custom features that they needed in our broadcast suite, which at the time was just our editor. And then we learned that, they actually need more than just editors. They need this whole workflow to be able to put news on the air. And so we started to build it slowly. And, we would call it custom work, but the reality, right? And this is also something we were very transparent with our customers about, that look, if you truly make us do a lot of custom work, it's not sustainable for us. It's not sustainable for this whole product. And so let's talk about what you really need. If there are truly things that are custom, let's see if we can change your workflow. And those things that other broadcasters need as well, maybe you can help fund some of this and we'll do this together. And so we actually used this approach and we had a shared vision with our customers and we built up our broadcast product suite. And within a span of about 5 years, we completely dominated broadcast. So practically every major broadcaster was using an Avid system in their newsroom. And it was all built through this, we called it custom, but we had this discussion with our customers that, let's figure out what's the workflow that'll work across all of broadcast for other customers too. And let's grow that together.
So is this like a customer advisory board where you get, the major networks to come together and say, let's plan this together? And are you almost taking an MVP approach even as you begin to target a new vertical?
Exactly. It was precisely that. We later introduced this idea of a customer advisory board. At the beginning, it was just relationships and this trust that, we were trying to solve their problem, and they also trusted us to try to do better for them.
That's fantastic. And I mean, clearly Avid has an amazing reputation, right? So I also imagine that you are knocking out an incumbent that broadcasters were already using, who had longstanding relationships, who knew their workflows. Why should they talk to you?
Right, exactly. And that was, our editors were kind of the foot in the door, because our editors were really new in the industry. We were really pioneers in how customers were moving from, tapes to digital. So we did have one innovation that helped us get in the door. But you're exactly right. When you have an incumbent that owns the entire workflow, we really had to offer up a solution that was meeting their needs. Otherwise, we couldn't oust that incumbent. And so we had to figure out, how do we build up that entire workflow? But you're exactly right. That required a lot of those discussions and building that trust. We had to share so much of our roadmap with them, construct so much of our roadmap together with our customers.
So this is the part where I think story plays a huge role. And I'm so glad you raised it, because what you said is we had to open up and share so much of our product roadmap with them. And so, when I talk with innovators about the innovation story, there are 5 pieces to that story. One is, what is our shared history? What can we both agree on? Where is the problem that we are both starting from? But what are the things we also have in common that we love about what we do and where we come from? The next step is, what is our purpose and values? And what is the story we tell about our purpose and values? And I often say, if we don't share the same purpose and values, I'm not getting into a car and going into the future together with you. I'm not willing to take the risk. And it's at the purpose and values, when we come together on them, that we actually create trust. And sharing that feels vulnerable, because we don't actually know whether or not our prospect shares our values. And so I love that you talk about saying we had to open our product roadmap. Well, they have longstanding relationships with your competitors. How easy would it be for a customer to say, look, we're talking to Avid. This is the direction they're going. Do you want to know about their product roadmap? Hit send, right? I mean, there is that fear that many entrepreneurs and innovators talk about, is I can't even tell my customer where I'm going next for fear of it getting out in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were actually building a product back then, which was called Journalist Editor. Until then, editing was always done by, people who were the editors. Journalists were out in the field taking shots, etc. But they weren't doing the editing. So we created this new product where it was editing simplified, so that journalists in the field could do edits and send it right away, and that could be broadcast. So it really cut down the time needed for, breaking news to get on air. And so when we were creating this product, we really needed that feedback from our customers. And there was this huge fear about, this could easily be something where word got out and somebody else could replicate that. But you're exactly right. We had to build that sort of trust with the customer so that they understood our roadmap, but that this was really special that we were sharing this with them. And yes, there were NDAs and all of that. But, yes, of course, NDAs are what they are, right? And yet, word never got out when we launched the product. It really was a surprise in the industry. And that was an example of building that partnership with customers. But the point that you bring up about the shared story with the customers and the vulnerability, this is exactly what I meant by, when you craft your vision, you have to see if it resonates with your customers. And a lot of the questions that you're bringing up are exactly kind of how you validate your vision with your customers, so that and there is that vulnerability, because if you crafted a vision that truly inspires you, you're really opening up yourself to a lot of disappointment if nobody else shares that sort of vision and shares what inspires you. You may have your strategy and you may want to share some pieces of it with your customers, but exactly all this hard work that goes into thinking through your purpose can really get shot down by a customer. But it's so important to do that early, because It's important to know whether or not it's actually going to work. There's so many people who say, but Steve Jobs has always said that you can't ask people what they want. You just have to show it to them. But the reality is even Steve Jobs did so much not market research, but user research and user testing. And that's often overlooked when people quote Steve Jobs on that.
I totally agree with you. And, I'm going to share in the link to this podcast a fantastic interview that Steve Jobs gave at one of the Macworld conferences where he was saying, we actually decided to throw out at one point our product roadmap and just go directly to the customer and say, we want to build for your experience, not for our desire to build something. So show us, teach us, let us learn from you. And it's for all the egotism that we talk about with Steve Jobs, there was an extreme humility when it came to saying customer experience first. Regardless if Apple is deemed to have the greatest design team in the world, the humility came at the foot of the customer. And so, that next stage of storytelling is the message. And part of crafting a great message around a fantastic product is we cannot go back to doing things the old-fashioned way anymore. There is inherently a shift where we examine your workflow and we understand where you're going, but we cannot go back to doing things the old-fashioned way anymore. And this is the part that is equally exciting and terrifying for that newsroom editor, right? Who now has to say, I will not go back to sending footage to HQ anymore, right? To network headquarters. I'm going to force my journalists in the field to be both journalist and editor. And this is where you really have to craft the right message that people will take it in, and also paint a picture of a future that will make that journalist the hero in the field. How did you do that, Radhika?
So by the way, it wasn't that journalists were going to do all editing, right? This was not to replace the editors by any means. It was just to make breaking news faster. And so how do we craft the story? It's market segmentation where, here's the message for journalists. It's the fact that by adopting this new tool, they can write stories and edit things into these stories so that you have both the words of your content as well as video, etc., where you can do all your simple edits just the way you want it to. And then your editor can actually, once you've crafted this whole story, your editor can do the more spiffy effects, etc., afterwards if you want, right? So it was understanding the needs of the editor, understanding the needs of the heads of the newsrooms, understanding the needs of these different players, basically, and then crafting the message based on that.
Got you. And so in this case, it's not a full-on disruption, right? But it is a radical enhancement.
Right, exactly. It's a radical capability that was allowed by this new technology that could have never been done before with tape.
And so, the next phase, once you get the message down and you allow this journalist to become the hero, right? I mean, I imagine there are whispers of, Peabody Awards, and there are whispers of, online journalism awards and things like that, broadcast journalism awards for those reporters who can actually go and bring the story to life in a way they haven't been able to do before. Then the next step is getting the early adopters, is getting that group of customers who's really excited about it to take your radical thinking and share it with the rest of the universe. So how did you find those initial early adopters who were willing to spread the word on your behalf?
Yeah, and actually, this is where some of the early customers who were giving us feedback came in. Those trusted partners with whom we had shared our roadmap, who had given us feedback all along, those were those early adopters who were really willing to talk about it because, in fact, some of their people had given us such good feedback. They were able to use this better. The product met their needs better, and they were willing to share that with other customers.
Wow. And so those other customers were their co-opetition, right? You had made them cooperate together to build this new thing, but they're really in the same ratings war, right, with one another.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating group of early adopters who are typically, at odds with one another, but now come together to get the best technology.
You just manage them separately, right? We weren't all asking them to be together in one room, but you just kind of manage that so that it is competition.
And they wound up spreading the word throughout their news organization in news bureaus around the world, I imagine.
Exactly.
And then lastly, how did you get that message then to marketing? So what did it look like when you actually started when you could write the brochures where you know exactly what you were offering? So what did it look like when it finally got to marketing?
So this part actually, and maybe we want to edit this part out only because we weren't really, at Avid, that was kind of split up. And, I would do it differently in my own company, but I'm not sure I want to get into that part too much.
Got you. Okay. So we'll just leave off that last part then. That's usually step number 5 for us is how do you make it spread around the world? So to reach that big vision that you were talking about.
If you wanted to cover that more, like the one thing that I do talk about is that the vision, you talk about it as spreading these ideas outside. Very often I talk about the idea of spreading this shared picture within your organization. And that's something that I write about in the book in terms of like, how do you spread this vision internally in your company so that everyone really buys into it? So that part I could talk about. But I don't know if you want to go there or you're mostly focused on the outside.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Avid is a big company, right? So it's a little bit different than thinking about that, 2 guys co-founding a company. The desire to spread internally is a little bit easier than like a big organization like Avid.
And so the target that you're talking about is mostly the small entrepreneurs. Is that right?
That's where we started. But I think
that's true.
The example was really great. I mean, people can see it much bigger in the universe from there.
Yeah.
Okay.
True.
So can I ask you about how that piece of your work wound up spreading through the broadcasting industry?
I mean, it was really a matter of the early adopters and then marketing the way we would, like that was about the period where I left soon after. So I don't really have too much data on kind of how they went about the marketing effort. They had been around for a while and they really had a marketing machine. So
got you. And that wasn't a piece that you touched?
Not really. No, it was really in terms of what do we build was what I touched.
Got you. Okay. So producers, we're going to pick it up from here. And I love these examples, thinking about this all the way from being a young entrepreneur, getting started, thinking about how you want to change the world as an innovator. Now, for our friends in corporate who are intrapreneurs, who are trying to make these changes, a lot of innovators internally, they don't necessarily start with a clean slate. Right? There is a portfolio of innovations that await them that they now have to take over, iterate, make viable, or shelf for quite a long time. And so this radical way of thinking, the term radical in its own right in corporate America, or maybe even global corporations, sounds terrifying, right? You are already coming in with a disruptive mindset if you are the radical. So how does one, looking at a new innovation portfolio that has, some things that are in progress, some are moonshot ideas, some are small iterations on a current product line. How does radical thinking apply in the corporate space? How should we begin thinking about that?
Yeah. So, if you have as a company this portfolio of products, one of the things that I do with companies is we start to write vision statements for each of these products, right? And the reason it's helpful is because your vision almost becomes an API to talk cross-functionally across teams. You write a vision in the same format, and I've created this fill in the blank statement so that I found that it's really, really hard, by the way, to start with a blank sheet of paper and try to write a vision. So we created this fill in the blank statement that makes it really easy. And so when you have the same format for a vision across all of these different products, then as someone more senior, you can look at all of these products and say, okay, I see how these are aligned. And in looking at what you're shelving or keeping, etc., you create this picture of how all of this portfolio is aligned, both with each other and with the vision of the whole company. And so that's one of the things that I suggest. But, what you said about radical and that word sounding scary, I think it's very true. But the reason I came up with the name radical product thinking is because radical means we're getting to the root, right? And it's going back to that purpose driven approach. That's really the root of why we build products. And so this purpose-driven approach, we can take it in the corporate world too. And that happens by starting with a clear vision statement for each of these products. So even if something is already an existing product, I found it really helpful to write this vision statement because, very often we think about a vision statement as something that you write once and that's it. It never changes after that. the reality is that markets keep shifting. I mean, there's no bigger shift than COVID in our recent memory, right? And so it's important to revisit our vision periodically and say, is this still true of the world when we define the who, what, why, and the how? And so that's a way of creating alignment when we come back and revisit the vision.
Right. And what a good exercise for your team anyway. And what a good conversation to have with C-suite leaders to say, are we still in alignment? Is this where we should be going on our innovation slate? And it's also for corporate innovators, a constant rebalancing against incumbent competitors and those new young scrappy startups, right, who are starting to nip at our heels. I'm very curious to know what the conversation was like at Hilton Hotels. You know, when Airbnb came along and said, two guys who are renting out their shed for people to sleep in, right? Or air mattresses in their apartment in San Francisco as the legend of Airbnb began. We don't have to pay attention to these guys. Give me a break, right? So the innovation portfolio in the hospitality industry now with COVID is going to take some very radical thinking to consider how to make those shifts. So as a corporate innovator who's looking to share that vision with the rest of the organization and not fall into the perils of constantly iterating for the sake of quarterly numbers or constantly responding to the flavor of the week new competitor that might pop up, how do you remain in alignment? And how do you know when it's time to pivot and not succumb to pivotitis?
Excellent question. So I think maybe two parts to it, right? So one is, how do you stay in alignment? And I think part of that is you have to stay in alignment within your own group and then stay in alignment across the organization. So in terms of your own group, I think that's a little bit easier because you set a clear vision, you can revisit it, but you translate that vision into priorities, and that's your way of using your vision every day. That fact that you use your vision in actually making decisions is what actually helps you continue to stay aligned. And that was the X and the Y axis of vision versus survival that I was talking about earlier. When it comes to alignment across different teams, this is where, even the strategy meetings, etc., that you have, one of the things that I talk about is when you translate your vision and strategy into your execution and measurement. I'm going to say something very contrarian and radical here. I actually really don't advocate for OKRs. I advocate for not using OKRs and product metrics in OKRs. And the reason for this, by the way, is that by setting goals for product metrics, it turns out that's actually a really detrimental effect on product teams. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But my point about keeping alignment across the organization is when you talk about product metrics, you talk about each team saying, what are we measuring? What is our vision? And how do our product metrics indicate progress towards that vision and the strategy? And each team presents similarly their vision, strategy, and what metrics, and then how they're doing. And through those presentations that everyone listens in on, you really keep an alignment on kind of how each team is working towards its vision and strategy, how there's alignment across the organization.
So, I'm thinking about that very standard conflict of we have a great innovation. We've done our homework. Our customers love our MVP. They're willing to dive in and give us feedback. In fact, we've collected feedback. Everybody loves it. It's now time to move over to the engineering team and say, I need 20% of your time. This isn't going to turn a profit for at least 4 quarters. I need you to pull your guys off of profit generating projects and move them onto mine. And by the way, we don't know if it's going to scale. How do we get that alignment going, Radhika, in a way that doesn't make both teams cry? How do we do that? How do we bring them along in the innovation vision?
Yeah. And so this is where, in the scenario that you just talked about, that basically looks at your X and the Y axis of vision versus survival and saying, you know what, I'm looking to your help to invest in the vision. This 20% that I'm looking for right now, we don't know if it's going to scale. We don't know if it's going to get anywhere. It's not helping us with survival for the next, year or two, but it's a good vision fit. And here's why it's a good vision fit. And so what we're bringing alignment on is, are we able to invest in the vision? And then you make a case for being able to invest in the vision. But I think recognizing, what is our vision and are we able to invest in it? That's kind of really the alignment that we're trying to bring about. And so one of the ways we talk about doing that as part of this radical product thinking is through those tools so that it helps you with the communication aspect.
Yeah. And that's my job. I try to help those innovation teams walk into that engineering meeting and going, okay. And so oftentimes, it is starting with I ask the innovation team to take a step back and say, you've come up with this great idea. Who cares? Someone else now needs to build it. So I ask my innovation teams to ask the question, how do we make the engineers the heroes now? How do we take a step back and say, engineering, in alignment with our vision for the whole company and what we want to see happen, how do we make the engineers the heroes now? How do we pass the torch? And so we say to them, in 2 years' time, when this product is scaled and it's all thanks to you, what will engineering look like in the context of this company? You guys will be wearing the capes now, not us. So you will be the superheroes here. Does that mean that you'll get a raise, a promotion, recognition, a bigger team, a bigger budget, a greater opportunity to share in the profit sharing of the business, to be recognized by the C-suite as bringing something new to life? And suddenly alignment with innovation isn't a drawback, it's an advantage. And so there's a humility on the part of the innovator too, to say, this is something that we can't do alone. And also to fight the question of, what if it fails? And you've just turned the torch over to the engineering team, and maybe it can't be scaled. Maybe it can't be built. And so suddenly you have 4 quarters of time that were, in quotation marks, for nothing. How does that alignment then square up in the face of failure? How do we talk about radical product thinking when, frankly, the product fails?
Yeah. First, I think in terms of failure, what do we define as a failure? If we discover early on that a product was not really needed and we haven't invested too much and it fails, okay, so the idea is, I think we want to accept failure, but to make failure acceptable, the less the investment that you put in, the easier it is to accept that failure. And so as part of radical product thinking, the idea is your vision is a hypothesis, your strategy is a hypothesis. And the reality is, through a series of experiments all along, you're trying to prove out whether this is a good vision or not, whether this is a good strategy or not. And so the whole idea with the execution and measurement, the radical product thinking way, is that you're basically setting up a series of experiments and you start as small as possible. And this is where you use things like the design sprint approach. There's the book by Jake Knapp and John Zeratsky on how to do design sprints in 5 days. So that's a great way of validating your strategy, especially. So each element in your strategy, you can validate with that approach. But, of course, that is a good set of experiments, but that doesn't tell you everything. You actually need real life stuff that's in the market. And so that's your next level of investment that you put in. And so, this is where you do your MVPs and you try to continue to make, increasingly bigger investments as you think it's warranted because you have proven out some things. So you're trying to burn down risks. And so I'm still in favor of doing all of those things like burning down risks and doing MVPs and doing experimentation. But my view is that it just all has to be driven by a clear vision and strategy. And by combining this radical product thinking plus the lean and agile approach, so basically lean and agile driven by radical product thinking, that's how you fail in small ways so that it becomes easier to accept.
How can our innovators, our product managers, and even our product marketers use the failure along the way to our advantage? Where's the learning that we can resubmit back into our alignment and our visioning moving forward when we fail?
Yeah. And so, one of the things that I talk about is often I find that products, when there are these failures, your momentum kind of really dips. And so one way of preventing that momentum from really dipping is after every failure, we talk about what have we learned. And then you revisit your vision and your strategy. And when you do that, right, it actually helps. Instead of it just being a failure, it becomes a learning experience where we say, here's what we've learned from it. And here's what we will try next. So it, instead of just being a downer, it tells you, okay, here's what it kind of sheds light on where to from here. Momentum, when it dips, is because we don't have a clear picture of where to from here. And so that's I feel the key to being able to, use failures. But, one thing that you brought up, this learning behavior, in reality, that's only really feasible if we have a culture that allows for learning behavior, one where we have psychological safety. So one of the chapters in my book is actually about psychological safety and how do we bring that about in our culture? So meaning, how do we engineer a culture where we can take this radical approach and build these successful products and apply a lot of these ideas? There's these radical ideas that I talk about.
Yeah. One of our guests was the chief innovation officer at Corning Glass. And when you have an organization that's been, effectively innovating for 169 years, they are discovering ways of using their products in the pharmaceutical industry that they never thought possible before. And when they went to the archives, they actually found solutions that had been shelved and deemed failures from the 1930s.
Wow.
Are now being applied 90 years later. And so, there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's just an idea that's not right for its time. When you have the ability to go back and recognize that all of that product discovery was in alignment with the goal, and yet it just hadn't found its market yet. So I think there's also hope, for those of us who work in innovation to say, not this time, but maybe sometime.
Exactly.
And there are even some innovation teams who put out their failure books every year as part of an annual report. So here's what the innovation portfolio has yielded. And let's talk about where in creating this culture, right, where you can be vulnerable. Here's where we failed miserably, but our hope is that the learning will be applied moving forward. And some undetermined time we may not even know, and maybe even those of us who are working on it today won't even be here when it's applied, but it can still be here for us. Well, this has just been a radical discussion about looking at product development and looking at innovation in a very new way. And I know we're so excited about your book. We have a couple of hot seat questions here on Innovation Storytellers that I would love to ask you. So, Radhika, what is your favorite innovation? When you look at the world of human history and how we've evolved, is there an innovation that you're like, wow, that's so amazing? What's your favorite?
Favorite innovation? There are so many things that we use every day. I'm not sure it's my favorite though. We can't seem to live without our phones, but I can't say it's my favorite only because it's something that I think what I've really realized in terms of what I've appreciated in terms of innovation is public transportation. If we can get public transportation right, I do feel like it makes the world better for so many people. I think that's an innovation that really showed its promise. And I think there's a lot more we can do in terms of how we can make that better.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. As a New York City strap hanger, subway rider, bus taker, I am with you. I am with you on that. What about an innovation buzzword that drives you crazy?
Disrupt. That one is an easy one. I hate the word disrupt because not everything needs to be disrupted.
That's right. That's right. And I also know you speak 9 languages as an electrical engineer from MIT. Can you tell us what are those 9 languages that you speak, Radhika?
It's, English, of course, but Spanish, French, Italian, Marathi, which is an Indian language, Hindi as well, and Tamil. And then I speak Japanese and Afrikaans, which is spoken in South Africa. And I'm currently learning Mandarin.
Wow. So for all of my lovely science listeners who are like, oh, I'm not a language person, I'm a math and science person, I want to introduce you to an MIT trained electrical engineer who is communicating and telling stories in languages near and far to all of you. So take that, get your communications hats on along with your science hats, and know that you can connect with people in full alignment around the world, around your vision. So Radhika, I also want to give you the opportunity. Where can we connect with you? Where can we follow you? Where can we get the most amazing information from you to begin thinking about things in a new way?
So I think a lot of what I talk about today, it's in the toolkit. There's a free radical product thinking toolkit that is on the website, radicalproduct.com. And by the way, it's free because this is a movement of leaders around the world who are applying this approach. And it's become this global movement with people on every continent now using it. So that's one way. Another way is you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. And lastly, I have a blog, which is also accessible through radicalproduct.com.
So radicalproduct.com.
Exactly.
That's the hub of all things great and small around alignment around your product and finding your product purpose. Radhika Dutt, thank you so much for joining us today. I know all of our listeners are going to start thinking about their own innovation process in a different way. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this, Susan.
This innovation story has ended, but yours is just beginning. Go to innovationstorytellers.com, download the free Innovation Storytelling Blueprint, and sign up to pre-order Susan's book, Innovation Storytelling. Get the resources, runway, and recognition you deserve due out this spring. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until the next innovation story.